Thank you, Victoria. I'm delighted to be here today at LiveFriday to speak about heroes and villains in the Ashmoleans' collection of Indian art. You can find the motive of the hero in Indian artworks all throughout the museum's extensive collection of South Asian artworks. This includes the god Vishnu in the form or avatar of Varaha, the boar, who engages in a 1,000-year war to save the earth, and this can be found on the lower ground floor, or Shiva, the destroyer, as Nataraja, lord of the dance, in bronze form, and who, once he places his foot down, indicates the end of time as we know it. These are incredible stories, but I am not here to talk about those pieces. My research interest is from a later period, in representation and iconography from the 17th and 18th century, particularly of female artists, and a type of miniature called Ragamala Paintings, which I shall discuss a little bit later on. So tonight I'll be talking about some of the museum's most striking miniature paintings from India that depict heroes and villains and how they relate to three central themes, which occur frequently not only in paintings, but right across the artistic spectrum, such as poetry and dance. And so these three themes are valor, betrayal, and desire, or the erotic element, which my title takes. So Hindu mythology. It would be impossible to talk or speak about the idea of heroes and villains in Indian paintings without talking about Hindu mythology, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Hindu mythology is like a banyan tree with stories taking numerous forms, spreading and tangling, which defy conventional wisdom and morality, yet are profoundly influential. And artists are constantly engaging and reinterpreting mythology in a very contemporary way, and connecting it with other myths of other civilizations, such as Greek mythology. So this takes us to the first image of tonight. And so here we have the image of Bhadrakali, destroyer of the universe, from the mid-17th century, Basholi, and it's from the Howard Hodgkinson collection. Here we have a grotesque image of a dark female figure with bloodshot eyes and a bloodied sword. She stands on the naked body of a corpse with her mouth open feverishly and eating the bodies of those she has slain. She's naked, but for severed hands that she wears around her waist. So now, do we think that she is a hero or a villain in this image? Villain? Yeah. That was a trick question. So Kali is in fact one of the manifestations of Devi, or the great goddess, highly revered in India, and one of my favorite deities. And here she is in her most terrifying form. And in fact, the severed head that she is holding is that of Brahma, the creator of the universe, and the bodies that she is holding are of Vishnu and Shiva, who combined represent the trinity of Hindu mythology as creator, preserver, and destroyer. And in this image, she is demonstrating her power over them, and to represent the idea that she operates beyond concepts of time. So basically, in modern terms, no one can mess with her. I've included this slide to show the image of Brahma, whose severed head or heads that Kali held previously. And in this image, Brahma is holding the Veda, the sacred Hindu scriptures, on his vehicle, the goose or swan, Hamsa in Sanskrit. So Hindu mythology, as the previous speaker mentioned, also has complex notions of good and bad, which cannot be placed in very simple categories. And they make us question, what do we mean when we define certain things as bad or good, when all life is meant to represent a single reality, which is the real metaphysical and metaphorical truth underlying not only these images, but perhaps also in the act of devotion to deities. So, key figures in Indian mythology. So this is another image from the Ashmoleans collection. Here we have four figures again, as in the previous image, in a more serene context. So left to right, we have Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma, who are paying homage to the Devi figure again, in a much more gentle image. And as we shall see later on in these figures take on numerous different avatars or forms, which reappear again and again in the myths and artwork. So I'll just quickly show this image where the goddess goes into battle. And what is striking about this image is that in the one image, we have the figure of Devi in two different manifestations. So this is a detail from that image. And in this detail, she is in the form of Durga, astride her vehicle, the tiger, and holding numerous different weapons, which are each quite symbolic. And in the next manifestation, she is again Kali, who we are now familiar with the garland of skulls around her neck. And another thing to consider when looking at this image, this is actually a very small image. It's only 12 centimeters by 23 centimeters. It's actually quite small. So I'd just like to briefly say a few words about Indian aesthetic theory. I'm not going to spend too long, but it is worth mentioning as it's one of the concepts which is unique to Indian art. It's quite difficult to translate, but it is a central preoccupation of artists. So the main theory is called Russa Theory, and rasa meaning flavor or juice, or the particular sentiments that arise in the experience of beauty. So whether that is in the grotesque form that we saw earlier with Kali, or in a more typically pleasing way. And artists aspire to create that arousal of that sentiment. So it could be perceived as a dialogue that is taking place between the art and the person who is viewing or experiencing the art. And while this concept was originally applied to drama and poetry, it is now used in the discussion of other artworks, such as music and dance, and indeed painting. So moving on to the three central themes, as I mentioned before, the first one being Valour. So it's really the figure of Vishnu, who we saw earlier in the form of Krishna, who dominates the artistic landscape as the hero in Indian art. Krishna is integral to Hindu mythology, particularly in North India, and plays an important part in the Sanskrit epic Mahabharata. So if we look to examples from the Ashmolean, here we have Krishna, easily identifiable with his dark blue skin, in the form of a warrior being greeted by princes, illustrating the musical mode Kannada. And this brings us to one of my special areas of research focus, Ragamala paintings. Ragamala literally means garland of ragas, raga meaning musical mode, of which there are several in the Indian musical tradition. So we're talking about music here, and the feeling that different music inspires, and how you translate that into an image. And music, amongst all the arts, is probably the most refined and studied in India, and of huge cultural significance. And the idea of hearing or oral culture is very important. The paintings are therefore an illustration of poems, which in turn evoke the mood of a raga. And in this painting, we have the musical mode Kannada, and the iconography associated with that painting, or that raga, is a warrior prince who has slain an elephant to prove his valor. And in this painting, you can see Krishna holding the ivory tusk in his hand. So, here we have another image of Krishna, as a young man dancing on the head of the serpent Kalia in the Jamuna River. And what makes this painting particularly interesting is that this is a Hindu motif commissioned by the great Islamic Mughal ruler Akbar. And as I mentioned about Ragamala paintings, and here again we have Vishnu as the fish avatar Matsya, and earlier I mentioned about the boar Varaha, which can be seen downstairs, and links back to the Dasharavatar story. So with Varaha, in this form, Vishnu takes on the form of a fish to save humanity from a catastrophic flood. So Krishna is one of the manifestations of Vishnu. Another form is that of Ram, regarding whom the epic Ramayana is based, which brings us to the next theme, betrayal. So this painting illustrates the portion of the Ramayana story in relation to Vibhishana, terrifying. Vibhishana was the brother of Ravana, and Ravana, as will be familiar to some in the audience here, was the demon king of Lanka, who abducted Rama's wife Sita. So when Rama and his allies, the monkeys and bears, lay siege to Lanka, Vibhishana tries to convince Ravana not to fight against Ram. And failing to do so, Vibhishana goes onto the side of Ram. And here he is depicted kneeling in front of Ram, and would later go on to take Ravana's throne in Lanka. And the idea of brothers fighting with each other and betraying one another is central to Hindu mythology, and most famously amongst the cousin brothers Pandavas and Kauravas in the Mahabharata. And betrayal is also an interesting concept to examine in the context of Rama with his wife Sita, who he unceremoniously abandoned after doubts about her honor were raised after she had been in the home of another man who was not her husband. So when we talk about betrayal, it is not only in the battlefield, but also in the romantic sense, which takes us to the final theme of my presentation, and painting. So our hero Krishna, who we're now familiar with, is the ultimate hero, but he's also quite naughty in the romantic sense. And by looking at Krishna's sensual exploits in this way, the erotic or sensual element known as Shringara has been explored by artists and is repeated in numerous times in Indian art. So here we have this beautiful example from the Ashmolean. In this panel, it features the poet, the 12th century Sanskrit poet Jayadeva, and the Gita Govinda specifically, which is featured in dance, music, and it's another clear example of the intersection between poetry and painting. And the Gita Govinda is a lyrical monologue which talks of Krishna's valor and triumphs, but also describes passionate scenes between the god Krishna in blue and Radha, his gopi or cowherd consort. And so in this image, we can see Radha speaking with her companion, the Saki, in the first panel, Krishna and Radha in scenes of lovemaking, and in quite a meta way, there is also Jayadeva in the last scene, writing the poem or reciting the poem that he himself has written. And it has been suggested by art historians that in this image, Krishna was confused as to who is Radha and who is the Saki. So just taking one detail from this panel, we have this intimate image of Krishna placing flowers on his lover's hair, which is quite a beautiful image. So that actually brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you to the Ashmolean and Torch Oxford for supporting it. The museum has a rich collection of Indian paintings, and there's an eminent historian of Indian art, Dr. Andrew Topsfield. So I do hope that inspires you to look further into the museum's collection and other examples of Indian art.